Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. Today we're talking about building an army for a game that doesn't even exist. So building an army always has its challenges, whether it be for Warhammer, another fantasy game, a sci-fi game, a historical war game, whatever you like. It involves challenges and it involves making decisions about A, what force do you want to wield, and secondly, once you've made that choice, what units do you collect to put into that force? And I think broadly speaking, there's three core concepts that go into making these decisions. The first one of these is models, the second is lore, the third is rules. So if I just unpack that for a moment, models. Basing a force around models you particularly like the look of. So if you're looking at undead, for example, and you really love the idea of blood knights, or maybe you really like the idea of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are cool. I'm going to pick up lizardmen. Reptiles on dinos, fantastic. There you've got a basis for building a collection that you're going to enjoy putting together. Then you've got the lore. Is there a particular aspect of the background of a particular faction you really like and that you want to dive into and explore with your collection? There's a concept to build an army around, or at least integrate elements of. And finally, there's the concept of rules. Looking at units that are going to perform well on the tabletop in order to maximize your opportunity to win games. Now, this may be a blend of looking to actively win games, but also not actively throwing out or hope of getting the odd victory by sabotaging your ability on the tabletop by picking stuff that's not very good. Now, my suspicion is in normal times we'd be looking at a blend of these sort of concepts. So it might be that we're particularly attracted to lizardmen for that dinosaur example. We find the dinosaur models really cool, so we're leading heavily into those, and then we're looking at how the obtaining of these creatures, the training of them, feeds into our army, perhaps leaning more into a skink dynamic to represent those responsible for doing those sort of things. But then choosing the dinosaurs that are best equipped to give us a fighting chance when we actually go to the tabletop. Now, this is all great, but for a game like Warhammer Old World that doesn't exist, we don't have access to all the information we'd normally have from these concepts. So we don't know what models are coming. We don't know what models are going to exist. And for the models that are being retired and then brought back as Warhammer models, well, we don't actually know which ones are going to have that process and which ones are just being permanently retired. So that means it's very difficult for us to choose purely on the models for the game because we don't necessarily know what they're going to look like. And then, of course, there's the rules. We have absolutely no knowledge around what the rules will look like, how the game will play, what units will be good, indifferent, or downright guff. So it's very hard to make choices around that basis. And I think this makes it very difficult for us to make decisions, let alone informed decisions, about what we want to do if we're collecting an army in preparation for the game. And broadly speaking, this gives us two options. And there's a number of people out there, I think, speaking quite persuasively in favour of both of these options. And ultimately, I would say it's a personal decision and we make the decision we think is best for us. What are these two options? Well, the first is to wait. See what the models look like. See what the rules look like. See how the lore is developed. There's loads of space for the narrative around the setting of the old world to be developed as it's the time of the Three Emperors, the decades leading up to the Great War against Chaos and the Chaos Incursion. it's an area that's not been hugely developed previously by Games Workshop, as there's loads of scope for it to become something quite interesting and with certain elements you want to lean into. So waiting is definitely an option. And that's before we start even thinking about the dreaded base size debate, which is perhaps also something that's pushing people to wait because they don't want to have to rebase or do funky things with movement trays or base extenders, etc. So what's option two? Option two is to push on. And if we are going to plough on like this, we've got to accept there's a number of risks, that we might be seeing new, better models that don't necessarily blend in with our existing collection. We also have to accept that in building an army, we might be building something that isn't going to perform on the tabletop, and that we are going to be battered out of sight until you can rectify the contents of your collection, if that's something you actually care about. And I accept not everybody does, because the painters, collectors, etc., they're not going to bother about that because they're not playing games on the tabletop. They're finding their enjoyment in other directions. So this brings us on to how do we proceed, or perhaps more correctly at this point, it's talking about how I've chosen to proceed. Now, I knew I wanted to do a dwarf force. The reason for this is my first proper Warhammer army, when I was actually playing the game rather than just shoving bits of plastic around as a child, was a dwarf force, and I wanted to collect something new for that force and paint it to a standard that I'm more happy with now, or happier with now, I should say. So how did I make my choices? Well, to start with, I thought about what makes the core of a dwarf force. What are the core elements here? Well, it's about the blocks of infantry, well armoured, great weapons maybe, hand weapon and shield maybe, supported by some missile weapons and an artillery train. So with that in mind, they're the kind of models I went for. I've not gone into buying gyrocopters and bombers and the sort of the funkier side of the dwarf force, in part because we don't know what base sizes they need, so we don't know exactly how to finish them off at this point, whereas we do have a really good idea with infantry that they can be on 25mm squares. But I think whatever happens with the force I've built, the core of it will see the tabletop if I get games with my dwarfs, because it's what the dwarf army's always been about. And from what little we've been told by Games Workshop, it looks like they're not planning major changes in directions as to how the factions operate at their very core level and what they're about. So the 8th edition stuff being viable, that kind of thing. Now the next point I've considered is diversification. Depending on edition, the way to equip your troops in the meta has been different. So in some editions you've wanted a sturdy and more defensive force, heavy armour, shield, hand weapon, able to take a charge, survive and grind through using that toughness, that armour and that high leadership to see you through. But at other times we've seen the pendulum swing to wanting your dwarf armed with great weapons to really dish out that damage. And in 8th edition we saw a lot, or certainly I did in my local meta, you saw dwarves tending to be armed with great weapons because step up, etc. meant there was still a lot of attacks coming back and you wanted to do more damage than your opponent and win the combats that way. So I've got a bit of both, with a view that depending on how I shuffle the models in units, I can probably either go exclusively hand weapon, shield or great weapons. Perhaps I will be playing with a blend of the two as I've collected them. Options are there, so I can lean into whatever the rules look like at the point of release. Then there's the final aspect, which is getting stuff I enjoy, that I want to paint. So at the moment, one of the advantages of not having rules means we're not hamstrung by that local or wider meta, and with me not wanting to build this particular army as being Games Workshop legal, I've no intention of turning it to my local Games Workshop store to play with this. It'll be at local gaming stores, clubs, things like that. I'm not bound rigidly by the very limited number of dwarf models which are currently available through Games Workshop, or then having to fight my way through the likes of eBay, etc., in the secondary market in order to find the figures that I want. Once I've decided what kind of unit I would like to collect and paint, I can look at the wider market and choose the model I like best and the one that will blend with my existing collection. So if I want a bunch of crossbowmen and I like the models from Company A, Company B and Company C, there's absolutely nothing to stop me buying models from all three and putting them together if I think that'll work well and if I'm going to enjoy going through that process. And having enjoyment of these projects, I think, is really important. Now, I fully accept that even having done all these things, I might well be building something that's just going to be battered on the tabletop. And that is very much a risk that I acknowledge that I'm taking. But I would rather, when the game gets released, to be able to quickly start playing rather than having to wait while I sort out an army or basing or whatever. And given that the game's been in production for so long and it's taken so long for us to get meaningful information, it's meant I've not had to rush with this project. I've been able to dip in, dip out, and enjoy even more so what I've been working on and not been up late at night desperately trying to get some models painted because I've got a game in a day or two and I need them ready for it. I don't have any of those constraints. I don't have any of those pressures. I can just enjoy the project. And whereas normally I'd want to get an army up and running much quicker than I have, so far I've been working on the dwarves on and off for over a year now. And I've got, at the time of recording, 34, 35-ish models to finish off, something like that. So the end is in sight. Until I decide to buy something else, of course. But hey-ho, that's always the way of things, isn't it, with these projects? So there we are, then, my thoughts on building an army where we don't have a game. Looking at our core elements, diversification to maximise the opportunity to use as much as we can, and most importantly, collecting to enjoy the process of building that force. Just want to say before I go, if you have enjoyed this video, do consider checking out other videos in the backlog. There's quite a few now, and do consider subscribing if you haven't already. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening to my thoughts on this subject. I'm returned to the old world. Have a great day.